Today's conversation is on winning at weight loss, primarily through carbohydrate control. And before I really get into the bottom, the beginning section of why carb control is so important, I really wanted to get into more of why we're even having this discussion. And the first part of it is, and I think this first slide might shock a lot of people. I know when I learned this from the World Health Organization a couple of years ago, I was blown away that headline, obesity or just being overweight now takes the place of hunger as the #1 global health crisis. And I think oftentimes we think of global health crisis and we think of these, areas of the world where people are malnourished, and now the fact that we're actually overnourished globally, it's become a severe problem. You can see that overweight and obesity are linked to more deaths worldwide than being underweight. Obesity is killing 3 times as many people as malnutrition. The next two, I think most of us probably are already aware of, that just under 70% of adults here in the United States are considered overweight. Out of those, 36, almost 37% of Americans are considered obese. As a pharmacist, a guy that used to own a drugstore, I'm very knowledgeable and very clued into the effects that different things have on the bottom line. And this number really blew me away when I learned from the CDC that someone who is obese, their average medical costs annually are $1,400 plus higher than people of normal weight. And just a sidebar on normal weight, I feel like in our country now that what's acceptable as normal weight is really someone that's probably 20 to 25 pounds overweight. I've seen it too many times. And then the last number comes from Duke University, and they're estimating that by the year 2030 that 42% of Americans will be obese. And I have to say that I feel like this is an underestimate. I feel like the way we're going in our culture with sitting being the new smoking and just the overconsumption of processed foods, that I feel like we're cruising to a much higher number than just 42% of people being obese. Why is it so important? I think this is another one. I think we often think of obesity as just someone that's overweight or well, obviously they are overweight, and but I don't think we often attach the risk factors to them. And when you consider the top 3 killing diseases here in the United States, heart disease and stroke, I combine into one. Cancer, #2 killer. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so those people with respiratory type problems. The #1, #2, and #3 killing diseases here in the United States all have a very strong direct connect back to being overweight. And from now on, I'm going to try to keep it just talking about people that are overweight and not overweight and obese, because I think we can all acknowledge that if someone is obese, that they're overweight. So I'm going to try to keep it just talking in a general term as being overweight, and assuming that means overweight and obese. Diabetes, the number 7 killing disease, and I feel like it keeps climbing. I can remember when I got out of pharmacy school in the 80s that diabetes wasn't even considered, probably a top 25 killing disease. And then one that doesn't cause us to die necessarily, but is one of the top debilitating diseases that we face, osteoarthritis. I like to throw things into my talks that are outside the box thinking, even though that's a cliche statement. Here, it's so important. I like to tell a little story, and because I think a lot of times when we're working with a friend, a family member, a customer, a patient, whatever you want to call them, with regards to their health, a lot of times we only focus in on what the actual problem is, as opposed to finding out what the root problem is or other ways to mitigate that health issue. And in the case of osteoarthritis, I think this is a huge area where a lot of people have joint pain, joint discomfort, joint inflammation, which is what osteoarthritis is joint inflammation. I think a lot of people have that now, and it's been rising in the numbers of people that have it because of the amount of weight that people are carrying around. And so I think a lot of times when we're, and the story I wanted to tell was back when I owned my pharmacy in the 90s, I had a customer who was scheduled for bilateral knee replacement, meaning both knees were going to be replaced. And her physician at the time had prescribed her medications that I would never consider recommending or prescribing, but they were to help her lose weight. And the doctor said the reason he wanted her to lose some weight before the surgery was to give her a better chance at, healing, more quickly. And the punchline of her story was that she ended up losing 35 to 40 pounds and actually ended up not requiring the bilateral knee replacement surgery because that added pressure on her knees was gone. And if you really wonder what that feels like, if you're like me, I don't have a problem with my weight because I do focus on doing the right things on a daily basis. But for those people that don't have a weight issue, and you're hanging out with me today, and you want to find out what someone that is carrying an extra 20 pounds around feels like, or an extra 50 or an extra 75, my favorite thing to do is have people that go into your local grocery store, walk down the pet supply area, and look at the dog food bags or the cat food bags or the cat litter bags and see what they weigh. And like a small bag of dog food might be 18 pounds, and pick that up and hold it around your stomach, and then just walk to the end of the aisle and back. If you want to find out what 45 or 50 pound bags feel like, they have the oversized. I have a chocolate lab, so I buy those big bags of dog food because she eats a lot, and carry that around, and you can realize what people that are overweight are dealing with. And or if you're listening right now and you're like, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to be honest with you, I feel like I am carrying an extra 25 pounds around. It's not too late to start the process, or at least stop the process of getting heavier. And if you want to feel what your body's going to feel like when you're 50 pounds overweight, find one of those 25-pound bags, pick it up, and see what it does to you. It causes, shortness of breath, and it causes knee stiffness and ankle stiffness and just overall fatigue. So if you're really wondering, the health risks that are associated with being overweight aren't just those diseases that kill us. They're also diseases that cause us to be a little bit more debilitated. So keep that in mind whenever you're working with people. Let's get inside some of the numbers now. There's one thing about this graph that, two things I really want to point out. One is, look where the spike of the dark gray, the extremely obese, really starts to rise. We're looking at the late 70s, so probably like 1976, I would say would be a good number. So the light gray area are people that are considered just overweight. And if you look at that line going back to 1962 all the way through 2010, it really hasn't wavered. The number of people that are considered, I hate to say just overweight, but just overweight has pretty much remained the same. That area of light gray are the people who fall into the obesity area. And you can see up until actually pretty much all the way across the board until 76, it remained the same, and then all of a sudden it started to spike. So from 76 on, the amount of people that are considered just obese, so these are the people that are between, they just found out they're obese, but they haven't reached the level of being overweight that would be considered extremely obese. And then again, same thing, the number of people that were extreme or fell into the extreme obesity, those numbers of people remained pretty much the same from 62 to 76 again. But for some reason, starting out in 76, that number started to expand. And there's no pun intended when it comes to the expand on the size of people. We're not talking the size in numbers. We're talking about the size in weight. So you can see that really the amount of overweight, just overweight, people that fall just under that obesity level hasn't really changed much, but the number of people that are considered obese or extremely obese has definitely risen. And then these are numbers I pulled from the CDC. These are factual numbers, breaking it down into some more demographics of blacks, whites, Hispanics, and then all over totals. The shades of gray apply to what we were just talking about, so that in this case the light gray is the total number. It's adding up all of the people that fall into extreme obesity, and then overweight. And probably the two big areas I want to point out here is that we seem to have, and I do a lot of radio and TV gigs in areas that are much higher urban populations, and a lot of the news anchors will even confirm this, that for some reason, in the more urban areas with blacks being in a higher population, they definitely see, for some reason, there is a much larger number of people that are severely obese. There are much more people that fall into the obesity category, and that also falls into as well as Hispanics. The reasons why, it really depends. One of my really good friends, who's a host for a television show, it's called Black Almanac. It's an urban show in the Sarasota television market with ABC. He always talks about food deserts, and he said a lot of these urban areas have food deserts, meaning there's really no place to get what they would consider healthy food. And so I think, as we're, depending on where we're working and the patient group we're dealing with, there's other sensitivities that we need to have and understand that, I can tell people all day long that they should eat a diet high in, fruits, veggies, nuts, seeds, legumes, and, avoid processed foods and eat lean cuts of meat, beef, pork, and chicken. But if they can't find them, that's a real challenge. And so these are things that we all need to keep in mind are the demographics that go behind this, and what environment do these people that you're trying to help live in as we're consulting them. So how did we get here? And some of the statistics I have kind of relate back to the whole increase in that started to show up in the late 70s, and this is my first slide, kind of shows this. If you look at it, and I'm a guy, so my ability to call out colors might be challenging, but we'll call the purple line are actually people that fall into the age bracket of 18 to 29. The light blue are people that are age 30 to 44. The darker blue line are people that are 45 to 64, and then the green line is clearly labeled on this. But if you can see that the guidelines that promoted low-fat diets came out in 1976. That's about when they all started. And so when we went low-fat, we took fat out of foods. So we took the fat out of cottage cheese and made it low-fat, no-fat. And when you take fat out of foods that we're normally accustomed to eating, cereals and pretzels and chips and things that normally had fat in them, when we started going low fat, or we stopped eating foods that had fat in them, like we stopped eating beef and pork and those types of foods because we got freaked out on fats. We started eating more things that didn't have those, like more pasta and more breads, and so when these guidelines started, like I gave the example of cottage cheese, they took the fat out. You got to do something to make it taste better. So they added salt. If you don't believe me, go to your grocery store when we're done here today and go to the cottage cheese section and pick up a no-fat cottage cheese and pick up the full-fat cottage cheese, and you're going to see there's a much higher sodium content usually in those because they've got to do something about flavor. And the same thing has happened in the carb area, where if they took fat out, they added more sugar. So this is one area I think that's really contributed to, how did we get here? The second is sugar consumption has dramatically increased I read that back in the 1700s, the average American consumed about 2 pounds of sugar a year. And of that, a great majority of that sugar was actually from natural sources. It wasn't it wasn't that they were eating candy bars and drinking energy drinks and sodas and things like that. They were getting it from their everyday diet. I looked up the most recent data I have was the average American last year consumed 153. I think it was last year. It might have been the year before. 153 pounds of sugar. And it's everywhere. You cannot avoid it. It's being added to everything, and because of this, I feel like number one and number two here are probably the biggest contributors to it. And then the third is, man, where are we eating? Look at this. Is staggering to me when you consider the green area is when people were eating at home. So the total amount of food expenditure is going up the left, and back in probably the 1930, we're talking about 85% of the money was spent on food for being consumed at home. Fast food started it looks like in the late 20s and 30s, and from that point forward, either eating away from home and or fast food now makes up about half of the dollars spent here in the United States. And I don't know about you all, but I travel a lot, and I do try to eat right. I never eat at fast food. I'm one of the freak Americans that doesn't know really what McDonald's sells anymore, or KFC. I'm pretty sure they sell chicken though. But I'm not one of those normal people. But I do eat out a lot, and even eating out in nice restaurants, sometimes the selections are getting to be more challenged. So I think that these three areas are the biggest areas and reasons as to why we've gotten here, why we went from, in the 70s, late 70s to, kind of having this standard rate of number of obese people, number of extremely obese, and number of just overweight to all of a sudden skyrocketing. And I feel like these numbers are going to continue where people are going to eat out more and more. We have these fast, active lifestyles. It's a lot easier to stop by someplace and get a pizza on the way home, or do the drive-by at the window at a fast food place. And I feel like unless we learn to stop doing these things and eat at home more, I just spent a month on the road, and being transparent with you all, I gained 4 or 5 pounds in that month. I've been home now for 2 weeks, and I've lost 7 pounds. And it's all about what you put in your mouth and the amount of activity. Granted, while I was traveling, I was sitting there a lot more often. So to me, what's the common denominator here? And I feel like if you look at the low-fat diet, or going low-fat, no-fat, started in the 70s, and that contributed to us consuming, I said earlier, more sugar, more starch, and more salt. Fast food is definitely, we're getting a lot more sugar and starch, and then of course just the amount of sugar consumption. So I feel like the common denominator here is really the amount of sugar and starch that we've consuming, and what's the difference. And I want to let you have, I'll have a flashback to science. So here we go. This is the Herbal Pharmacist Starch Metabolism 101 slide. And so where does starch come from? Starches are found primarily in the processed grain foods that we eat. So when you're eating pasta and bread and or white potatoes, rice, white rice, those are high starch foods. There are some vegetables that fall into high starch, but they usually don't have that negative effect on our waistline. But so when we consume a starch, unless it's broken down, it's going to pass right through you. Just the way it goes in your mouth is the way it goes out your backside, unless the enzyme called amylase, which is like that pair of scissors there. Amylase will actually attach to the starch, or it'll actually cut it up into small pieces. And what does it cut it up into small pieces into? It cuts it up into glucose and fructose. And those are real easily absorbed into the bloodstream. And when they're absorbed into the bloodstream, the body does one of two things with them. we either use that glucose and fructose as a source of energy, or we will store it as fat. And there's some other physiological processes that go along with it, and I'll cover some of those later. But so real quick, this is starch metabolism 101. So if you're consuming a diet that's high in sugar, glucose and fructose, you can see where those are readily absorbed. Nothing really needs to happen. So that's why I feel like that's such an important part of this obesity epidemic and why so many people are overweight in our country. But if you're consuming starches, and a lot of them, a lot of Americans are, we're having cereal for breakfast, we're having a sandwich with a lot of bread, or even fancy bread, whatever, I don't really care. That's a starch. And at dinner, we're having a lot of pasta, we're having a lot of rice. The number one vegetable people consume in the United States are potatoes. Those are just great ways to pack on the pounds. And so, to me, starch is just as evil when it comes to our body, and not only managing our waistline and the amount of weight that we carry, but also in other areas such as our blood sugar issues with type 1 and type 2 diabetes, more specifically type 2, cholesterol issues, and I'll get into more of that towards the end of my presentation today. So throwing even more into this, consumers are actually confused about what carbs are. This was a nationwide survey conducted by Consumer Experience Partners, and it was sponsored by Pharmachem, who was the sponsor of my talk today as well. But they surveyed people, and they found out that people were really unable to determine which foods contained the most starch. Over a third of the time, people just didn't have a clue. Sugars and fats were listed before carbs as the major foods that were contributing to weight gain. In my experience, just my own observation, I feel like people think of fat as the worst thing for them, and that fat will make you fat. Sugar will make you fat would be number 2. And then I really think that, carbs are way down the totem pole on that. Most of the people felt, you can see only that only 23% of their diet was represented by consuming starches, yet 83% of the people consumed eating a starchy food like a bread or something similar within the previous 48 hours. So, they're saying, hey, you know what, starches really aren't part of my everyday gig when I eat, but hey, guess what? Oh, you know what, I kind of forgot. And I've run into that with people before. I used to have a consulting business with people who would come to me with health issues, and I'd make them bring all their supplements with them, and or I had just a survey to fill out, and a lot of times they'd only list like their multivitamin, and then as our conversation increased, and as I dug around into their health issues, they're like, oh no, well I do take glucosamine, oh well I do take turmeric, oh well and so I think this confusion about health is not just necessarily limited to the carbs, but you can see with regards to weight, this could be a very serious issue. Almost 2/3 of the people, claim to be snacking on crackers, chips, or pretzels. And consumers are definitely confused about what a good carb is and a bad carb. And I can tell you that this one area about consumers being confused about what a good carb is versus a bad carb has nothing to do with their level of education. Because of my travel experience that I have and what I do in the media and the numbers of people I meet, with masters, PhDs, college level, it doesn't matter. I find that almost everyone seems to have some sort of confusion about what carbs are good and what carbs are bad. And then a little sidebar to this thing, this is my own personal observation, and I think more and more people, depending on what level you're at in the industry of helping people with their health, but I really feel that consumers think that because something is considered non-GMO, gluten-free, or organic, that it's healthier than the same food without these labels. And I'm going to argue with you that yeah, I have to say, GMO, it's definitely a better option than non-GMO. I mean, non-GMO is better than GMO. Gluten-free, I feel like it's really only better for people with a gluten issue. And organic, yeah, I think it's definitely, some research recently showing it may have higher nutrient contents, and of course we definitely don't need to consume the pesticides and fertilizers and all that stuff. But hey, a non-GMO, gluten-free, organic cookie is still a cookie. Excuse me while I take a sip there. So yeah, I want people to understand that. And I think, people see gluten-free pasta and like, hey, it's gluten-free, I can eat it, or I can eat more of it, or it's a non-GMO cookie, or it's an organic cookie, and it's still what that food is. It's still going to have the same negative effect on our topic today of your waistline. So then there's also dieting confusion. So what diet's really the best? And that's where I'm going to start here. The Journal of the American Medical Association back in 2014 published this article, and the summary really is this. So they basically looked at 59 eligible articles that reported 48 unique randomized trials. And you can read the numbers there. It's over 72, almost 7,300 individuals. And what they did was they compared the diets. They wanted to find out, hey, which diet is really the best. And what they found was the largest weight loss of all the diets out there was associated with a low-carb diet. So, hey, maybe that doesn't float your boat. Let's go to number 2 in the Annals of Internal Medicine, 2014. So these are relatively current, all right? I mean, they're only a couple years out from where we are today. At 12 months, they found at 12 months, those in the low carbohydrate group had lost over 7.7 pounds more than people in the low fat group. The low carb group had significantly greater reductions in body fat and improvements in lean muscle mass. This is critical. I want to point this out. This is critical. The improvements in lean muscle mass and reduction in body fat. When we're trying to lose weight, the number one thing we want to focus on is losing the fat and maintaining the muscle mass. So anytime we can do those two things, because what happens in most weight loss programs, and this is why even in the weight loss supplement industry, when we were doing and taking and recommending supplements that the fat burners and the ones that really revved up your metabolic rate, those things really had, granted you lost weight, but they didn't have a huge effect on your ratio of body fat and lean muscle mass, meaning that people lost muscle mass along with the fat. And anytime we lose muscle mass in our body, we actually lower our metabolic rate, meaning we don't burn as many calories as we normally would because we don't have as much muscle mass. So a low-carb diet had a positive effect on, one, helping people reduce the amount of fat, which is really what you're trying to do here, trying to get rid of the fat that, that puts more stress on your internal organs and adds more weight. But at the same time, people were able to improve their lean muscle mass. And to me, those are probably that is probably the biggest area that I think that most people fail on weight loss. And that's why a lot of people, when they do lose weight and they don't do it properly, they lose it too fast and they don't do the right things. They're using stimulants or not eating the proper diet, that after they finish eating that way, that they actually gain a lot of weight back because they've lost the muscle mass. They've lost that lean muscle mass that's going to keep their metabolic rate higher. And so now they go back to eating perhaps the way they were, but now they have less muscle mass than they did before, so their metabolic rate is slower, and they're going to gain weight back even quicker than they were beforehand. And then last but not least, kind of driving home this point, Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. This goes back to 2003. This was a randomized trial comparing very low-carb diets and very low-fat diets on body weight and cardiovascular risk factors in women. And you can see right there, the very low-carb diet lost more weight. You can see 8.5, and that's kilograms versus 3.9. So they lost more than twice the weight than the low-fat group. And the low-carb group lost more body fat again. And, I think a lot of this, again, goes back to when we go on a low-fat diet, we tend to eat a lot more carbs going back to my slide earlier of, that carbs break down into sugar real easy. Sugar gets used as energy or fat. With most of us, we've turned ourselves into fat factories. So what's the solution based on what I've shown you so far today? For me, it's to go with a carb reduction. And since most people are really not necessarily too interested in going, changing their diet and eating low carb or no carb, and I challenge you to try to do that. It's not an easy thing to do. I currently have a 16-year-old daughter at home that's been trying that, and after day 2, she's a miserable little thing. I wish I could put her on with us right now. Anyway, so I'm a big advocate of phase 2. I learned about phase 2 over a decade ago, and it's one of my my dietary supplement ingredients that I'm a big fan of because they have the clinical backing, they have the safety profile, and within the clinical backing, they have, it shows it works. How does it work? Well, it binds alpha amylase and preventing the conversion of starch into glucose. Remember my little chart? I'm going to show it to you again in a second of that. So it binds amylase, the enzyme that breaks starches down into sugar. It's clinically proven to reduce 66% of that starch from being broken down. So real quick, visual, 1,000 words paints a picture. Instead of a picture says 1,000 words. If you can imagine 3 slices of bread sitting in front of you right now, let's say you take your phase 2 right now, take your phase 2, and then you eat your 3 slices of bread. Phase 2 works to block 2/3 of that starch from being broken down into sugar. So if what I'm saying is true, and it is because the data shows us it is, so there's no if in there, when you finished eating those 3 slices of bread, the caloric effect of those 3 slices, if you've used phase 2, would be as if you've consumed 1 slice of bread. And I don't care if you're talking about white bread or you pick your favorite bread. That's the analogy. That is how this works. And the way, again, it works is by blocking amylase from attaching itself to starch so that it can't cut it up into small pieces. And it's shown in clinical trials to promote weight loss, reduce blood glucose levels after a meal, and again, going back to the whole metabolism and how phase 2 works, if we're keeping starches from being broken down into sugar, you're going to have less of a caloric effect, less of a sugar effect from that starch, because only 1/3, if you've taken your phase 2 properly, will actually make its way into the bloodstream. And then the biggest thing for me is no side effects. I mean, as a guy, as a pharmacist, and used to be a practicing clinician, anytime I can help people avoid side effects. So again, just a quick reminder, this is how phase 2 works. If you can imagine, you've consumed starch. The little chain of connected smiley faces. If you've taken your phase 2, you've now basically broken that pair of scissors. It doesn't work the way it's supposed to, so you're not going to be able to chop up that strand of glucose and fructose molecules into the small pieces they need to be absorbed. So it's as if you've blocked 2/3 of that starch from being broken down, and that's why I wanted to show you this chart one more time. So let's talk about some of the studies. This is the largest study to date, just kind of showing you that some of the actions of phase 2. In the phase 2, this was in the Obesity Society. They found that people who used phase 2 lost an average of 7 pounds more than people in a placebo group after 12 weeks. I gotta say, one of the things I love about supplements in the weight loss arena that have science behind them and that don't work too quick. You don't want to shed weight fast. You want to learn a new lifestyle when you're losing weight. It's not always just about how you eat. It's about learning other lifestyle behaviors. And so, and to lose weight and to keep it off, really, we do know in science that the best way to do it is maybe a pound a week. And so, in this study, people lost an average of 7 pounds compared to placebo after 12 weeks. Almost 74% of the people were able to maintain their weight after this, up to the end point of the study of 24 weeks. Why is this important? Well, think about it. How many people have you run into, or how many people that are listening right now have gone on a weight program or heard about somebody that went on a weight loss program? They got down to the weight they wanted, and then within weeks, they started gaining their weight back. Sometimes within the first week, they start gaining the weight back. The biggest objective about losing weight is to keep it off. And in this study, almost 74% of the people were able to maintain successfully their weight after 24 weeks. The active group lost more body fat, again, and their waist circumference went down. Why? Well, going back to the whole thing of the starches and being broken down into sugar, and then sugar is either used as energy or stored as fat. When we start storing things as fat, when we go low carb, we turn our bodies into fat-burning factories, as opposed to when we go into a low-fat diet, we're consuming a lot of starches and sugars and sodium. We've turned our body into something that's going to get fluffy. And then last but not least, after 12 weeks, the people that were taking phase 2, and this is another really important thing to me, it's not something that happens necessarily right away, but it happens over time. People started having less cravings for their foods, and primarily sweets within that. The Mexico study, this is another cool one, 30-day study of 50 overweight and obese individuals. They took 1,000 milligrams of phase 2 a week, 3 times a day with their high-carb meals. Notice in red, no special eating or exercise program was required, so basically people kept doing what they were doing. 98% of the people completing the study had a reduction in their body weight of 1.8 kilograms to 3.8 kilograms. That's a lot of weight considering it's a 30-day study. Granted, people that are overweight or obese tend to lose a lot more weight quickly than people that are only 5 to 10 or 15 pounds overweight. And again, another key thing that I love is to have no adverse reactions reported. So again, lots of clinical data, not just on the effectiveness, not just on how it works, but on the safety as well. And one of the biggest concerns I have as a retired pharmacist, I still have occasionally I will consult with people on their health issues, but the number one thing for me is really having something I can recommend that has the science behind it to show how it works, how much to take, has the safety to go with it, and those studies and safety things are also published. And they're done on human beings as opposed to animal trials, because I feel like, to me, that's the most compelling way to get your point across, and to feel reassured and assured that you're able to recommend something to someone and know that, one, it's going to work, two, it's not going to cause more problems for them down the road. So another thing that I think always adds to credibility of any product out on the market is when you have a governmental agency, and let's not get into politics right now, allowing more and more things to be said. So you can see in the U.S., the FDA has allowed certain structure function claims to be made. For anybody that's a healthcare provider that's dealing with people, you have to be careful nowadays with the FDA, FTC, and on things that you can even speak to a patient or a customer in a store or a practice. So you can feel rest assured in the U.S. and in Canada that there are certain claims that can be made. And anytime you can say AIDS and weight control, that's a big thing here nowadays, because I always feel like the government's really going after people that are making weight loss claims, because there's so many fake, and pardon my language, BS products out there. So for the government here in the U.S. and Canada, and actually abroad, to be allowing claims like weight loss to be used, I think it's a very it adds even more credibility to the ingredient phase 2. So whether you've got a health food store or another retail establishment, or you're a practitioner, whatever level you're at, when can you or when should you recommend phase 2? And a lot of these may not make any sense initially for you, because obviously my talk today was on weight loss and the effects phase 2 has on blocking starches, but cholesterol concerns, I'm a big advocate of recommending anything that will help people everybody thinks that fat and cholesterol are why people have high cholesterol, and it's actually more so related to what's in your everyday diet with regards to the amount of sugar that's floating around in your body. So anytime we can have an effect on lowering blood sugar, we can have a positive effect not only on blood sugar, which is number 2 there, but also on cholesterol, because that's what your body will use sugar through metabolic processes to make to make cholesterol. So this is another one of those outside the box. And granted, I'd have to say that you think about it, 70% of the population is overweight. A good portion of those have cholesterol issues. Here's a way you can recommend something that's going to help people, and they probably have blood sugar issues as well. You could, I don't want to say it's one-stop shopping, but great way. People that have pain and inflammation from weight-bearing joints, hips, knees, ankles, help them lose some weight. Maybe the reason their glucosamine is not working for their joint health issues is they're carrying an extra 25 pounds. So, find a tactful way to address them about integrating something to help with their weight that will take off the weight from their weight-bearing joints. Chronic stress. So this doesn't necessarily have an effect on the stress level, but what it can do is help those people that have increased cravings when they are under stress. I think we all have those foods that are go-to. We call them comfort foods. And so if someone is under a lot of stress, then there's a good chance that they're reaching for the wrong foods. And in this case, the wrong food may be those carbs. And we know that not only do those foods contribute to weight, but we also know stress has a negative effect on cortisol. Cortisol has a negative effect on insulin resistance. And so it's like fanning the flames of a fire. So phase 2 could be a great part for someone that's under a lot of long-term stress to help them maybe as a preventative for gaining weight and or maybe helping them lose weight. Carb addicts, man, who isn't one of those these days? Maybe you don't even eat carbs. Maybe you are already, dialed in on carb control. I tend to be that way. So for me, it's when I'm going out to dinner, vacations. Those are times when you're probably going to celebrate, do things maybe outside the box, or maybe you already eat carbs, you're not worried about it, but yeah, you're gaining weight, and you're going to go on vacation, you're going on a cruise, you've got birthday parties coming up, you've got holiday celebrations coming up, you're going to probably eat more of those foods that are high starch, and so phase 2 is good for them. Teens, they're carb addicts, man. It's crazy. I've gone through 2 teenagers, one's 16 right now. I see it all the time in what they eat. I go out with them to dinner. I go out to lunch, and I think this is a great thing to help perhaps mitigate some of the obesity we might be facing in the future by having teens use it. And then last but not least, this may sound kind of dorky to a lot of you guys, but any time for anyone. I feel like going back to the slide I talked about with people that are just confused on what carbs are good, what carbs are bad. Am I even eating carbs? Just to use phase 2 as part of your everyday supplement program around your meal. So if you're having a meal or a snack, take phase 2 before your meal or snack, and it'll help block any of the, at least 2/3 of the starches that are in that meal. So you can eat a little more and absorb a lot less is one of my favorite things, because most people are struggling with carbs either as an addiction issue, I like to say, or they're just confused about it. So these are some great ways that aren't necessarily revolving around directly on the weight component that you could also recommend phase 2. And again, phase 2, because it's about the carbs. And last but not least, if you need more information, more detailed information, here's the information for Pharmachem Laboratories. They are actually who has the ingredient phase 2, and for more detailed information, you can reach out to them directly. And I believe we're also making my slides available today. So I'm done with my part. I'll be glad to answer some questions now.
Yeah, it looks like we have a few questions here, David. I think the first one we have here is, are there any side effects or known interactions when using phase 2?
At this point, there should be no side effects from using phase 2. I think I'm going to address one that people think happens, but it doesn't. A lot of people think because it's inhibiting starches in your diet from being broken down that it may cause digestive problems further on down, like small and large intestine. That's the one that's often assumed, especially by the more savvy health experts, I guess. And that does not happen. So, I brought it up, but it does not happen. And then as for interactions, I'm unaware of any direct, like known interactions. I do want to bring up one thing, though. If I'm dealing personally as a practitioner, if I'm dealing with somebody that has blood sugar control issues, and they're taking something for that, I don't think there's a direct interaction. But at the same time, the person needs to be understanding that they're not going to get the same effect on their blood sugar they would from the way they've been eating when they incorporate phase 2. So basically saying if someone is already eating a diet high in starches, or maybe not even high in starches, they just have an average number of starches in their everyday diet, but they do have blood sugar control issues, and they're being monitored for that, and they're taking a medication. Phase 2 will block some of that sugar from being broken down, and so from that starch from being broken down into sugar, and so it will have an effect on lowering their blood sugar. So in that way, there would be an indirect interaction. But as for any other known documented interactions, I don't really believe they are. That's more of me as the pharmacist understanding biochemistry and physiology, saying, hey, if you've got somebody that has blood sugar control issues and they start using this, there's a possibility that they may not require as much of their medicine down the road, but that's something they need to take up with their healthcare provider.
Excellent. And did you actually answer this? I got another question here. You may have gone into it in your answer that you just made now, but I have someone asking me, are there any adverse effects on the undigested carbs in the GI tract?
Right. No, there are not. That's what I just went into. And actually, a very interesting sidebar on that is that when we have complex carbohydrates enter the small and large intestine, so in other words, complex meaning it has those things have not been broken down into the microparticles that get absorbed, that a lot of those complex carbs end up being prebiotics for those friendly bacteria. So the answer to the question is no, it does not cause digestive problems further down. And if anything, I believe it could actually help act as a prebiotic. Has it been proven that way specifically? No. But so I'm not saying they've proven that at all, but I'm just saying, again, knowing physiology, biochem, from my pharmacy days and naturopathic days, I feel like that undigested complex carbohydrate could end up being a prebiotic, so it could actually provide some benefit as opposed to be a detraction.
Excellent. What else we have here? Can phase 2 be taken with other weight loss supplements?
Definitely. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk at a large convention in Vegas on weight loss, and I actually did mention the use of others. I feel like that we're not all created equal. We don't all have the same problem, and in most cases, a lot of us in the weight category may have multiple reasons why we are overweight now. So I do definitely think that like it could be combined with something like a tonalin, which is the fat, or it could be combined with something like a super citramax, or I feel like there's an abundance of other, again, patented, trademarked ingredients that are out on the market, that have that science that I'm talking about that phase 2 has, but work in a different mechanism of action. So I'm a firm believer in a shotgun approach to health, meaning if I have a weight problem, if I could incorporate 2 or 3 patented trademarked ingredients, or like a chromate or a chromax, or one of those things that have the science to show it works, but works in a different way, I feel like people are going to get even better results. So definitely look at that. I do not recommend combining it with stimulant products out there, though. I think stimulants for weight loss are selling America a false bill of health and health. And I'm big negative on those things, but there are a lot of good ingredients out there that don't have that effect that I think you could definitely use.
I have a question here about dosage. It says, if a weight control formula contains a total serving size of 2,880 milligrams of phase 2, will this still be as effective as 3,000 milligrams?
So will 2880 be about the same as the 3000? I can tell you that the way phase 2 works, it's linear. In other words, if you eat more carbs, you take more phase 2. It has that effect. I feel like so one is, I don't know the specific answer. I'm going to lean on all my education and say I feel like you're splitting hairs in the 120 milligrams there personally. So I feel like there's really not going to be a lot of difference, but the study I showed did talk about the 3 grams. So that's what the science shows. But in my head, I feel like you're splitting hairs with 120 milligrams in a daily dose.
And speaking of daily doses, how often should phase 2 be taken?
Well, again, for me, I feel like it probably should be taken with all meals for sure. Because again, going back to that whole thing of people are carb confused. If you're like me and you're not carb confused, or my poor 16-year-old daughter who I've beaten to death with what good carbs and bad carbs are. For us, it's maybe not as important to take it all the time, but for the average American, I feel like taking it with at least all meals would be great. And then considering that a lot of us, don't know what good carbs and bad carbs are, and we still have snacks, maybe midday, and then again at night, then even with those snacks, it could be used. When I do have snacks, mine are carbs, and I don't take as much of it when I have a snack because it's only going to be a small amount. And then with meals, I will take a full serving size. I'll usually take 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of phase 2 when I know I'm eating a meal that's going to have it's a starchier meal. Let's put it that way. So with meals and snacks would be for the people who just are confused on what carbs are. And then for those people who are really dialed in, maybe you just take it when you really need it, when you know you're going to be cheating.
Fair enough. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have. I want to thank you, David, for the excellent presentation. We at Whole Foods would also like to thank Pharmachem Laboratories for partnering with us on this informational webinar. I would also like to thank our listeners. And you will be able to access a recording of this webinar on our website at WholeFoodsMagazine.com within the next few days. Have anything else to add, David?
No, I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Pharmachem for sponsoring it. I want to thank you guys for allowing me to do this and share my passion, which is just helping people achieve health. So, and if people have follow-up questions, feel free to email me, contact me through my website, herbalpharmacist.com. I would love to help people get healthy.